My name is Dana Scheider. My pronouns are she, he, and they. I'm a senior engineer at Envato, based out of Melbourne, Australia. And today I'm here to talk to you about quality assurance without a dedicated QA department. So quality is a topic that's always been close to my heart. I've gotten into the dev field by starting off as a quality engineer, and test-driven development has always been very important to me, especially as a member of the Cucumber core team. It's something that I've focused on quite a bit. In my current organization, it's been a bit different than in past work, because one of the things about Envato is that we don't have dedicated quality engineers or any kind of QA department. It's all on dev teams to ensure the quality of development work. But we also do try to look at quality from a more holistic perspective. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about today. I'm going to be discussing QA within the framework of total quality management, a framework built in the Japanese manufacturing industry in the 1950s. And so I just kind of want to talk about how we at Envato and how I like to ensure the quality of a product without having dedicated engineers to it. So before we move on, the best place to start, I think, would be agreeing on a definition of quality. The one I propose is the suitability of a product for its intended purpose, evaluated from the perspective of the consumer. There are a few things that work here. There's the suitability of the product for its intended purpose and evaluated from the perspective of the consumer. The most important thing is the part about being evaluated from the perspective of the consumer. The person who ultimately consumes the final product is the person who determines whether it's suitable for that purpose. And so that's the perspective that I'm going to be looking at things from. There are definitely other dimensions of quality that aren't necessarily visible to consumers, but I would argue do eventually affect consumers, things such as maintainability of code that may not immediately be obvious to someone who's using an application, but at the same time can affect how quickly features can be released, can affect how buggy the experience is. All of that stuff does tie in. So I'm not suggesting to ignore it, but simply to look at it from the angle of how it affects end users. So there are several elements of software quality from the perspective of end users, and I have left out maintainability and certain technical considerations like that. The main ones are the functionality. Does the app do what it's supposed to do? Performance, does it do it quickly enough? UI and UX are really important dimensions of quality that I really want to emphasize here as well. The idea that the side of the dialog box your buttons are on is a dimension of quality. The colors of your UI are a dimension of quality, and so that's an important aspect as well. Freedom from defects, that's the definition that a lot of people use in software to talk about QA, but I want to propose that that's a pretty limited view and look at things a little more holistically. And finally, consumers may not prefer it, but security is also an element of quality, protecting people from themselves and making sure that they're not going to fall victim to data breaches or things of that nature. So at this point, now that we've kind of nailed down the definition of quality, I want to move on to a comparison between traditional software QA versus total quality management, or TQM. So when we look at a traditional software QA process, we're looking at something that happens toward the end of the development cycle. So during or after the development phase, most often after. QAs don't influence the product definition or design. They only kind of come in after development is done to find and fix defects and limit themselves to that scope. So this is an approach that's not based on the overall suitability of the product, but only on freedom from defects. The nice thing about QAs and QEs, quality analysts and quality engineers, is that they often do have training and experience that most developers don't. And I don't want to understate that. The ability to creatively break things is a very valuable skill that QAs bring to the job. And when you're approaching quality without QAs, it's a skill that developers need to learn. So the biggest difference under total quality management is a customer focus. Total quality management, like I mentioned, was developed in Japanese manufacturing in the 1950s, and it was focused on quality from the beginning of the process to the end. And by beginning, I'm talking about requirements gathering and product design. So it again starts with a customer focus. And to the customers, the first question they're asking is not going to be, does it have defects? The first question they're asking is, does this do what we need it to do? Is it easy to use? And so the first questions that you ask in a TQM process are we building the right product? Are we building it in the right way? How well does it serve the customer? Another core component is employee empowerment. So employees, and it can be anyone, from the CEO down to the janitor sweeping the shop floor. Employees can speak up when something isn't right. They have adequate autonomy. They're not overworked or burned out, and they get ongoing training to improve their skills. If this sounds like total quality management is an organizational approach more than a process approach, then you're absolutely right. That is the major differentiating factor between TQM and traditional software QA. So fact-based decision-making is another aspect of this. So management and leadership has to have the ability to evaluate decisions based on available evidence, based on research, and based on facts. And the organization as a whole has to be focused on continuous improvement of its processes, but also of the products themselves. So if all of this seems too good to be true, I will get to how you can implement it in your organization. Spoiler alert, some organizations are going to have an easier time than others with this approach, and I'll talk about what those components are in a few slides. So before I do that, though, I want to talk a little bit about the benefits of TQM. So with TQM, quality management starts with product specifications, visual design, development approach, and code quality. There's that again. Quality management is focused on all elements of design and development and not just fixing defects. That's the biggest thing I want to emphasize, because defects turn out to be only a small part of quality. The biggest benefit of TQM is that there's less of a need to release patches, less of a need to iterate on product design if you've already been doing this from the beginning of your process and have empowered everyone involved in the process to provide feedback, to if need be, prevent things from being released in a low quality state. The thing I want to emphasize, if you get nothing else out of this talk, is that quality is always the responsibility of an entire organization. So I'm an engineer. My background is primarily back-end, and I can also recognize problems with UX. As a user myself of many different types of software, I'm able to tell you if that OK button and cancel button should be on the opposite side. This is an actual example from using my bank app the other day. So you can tell I have a bee in my bonnet about that. But yeah, so likewise, sometimes design and product people can give insight into each other's work, and to a certain extent, even into development work. And so it's really important for people to work together to make all of that go smoothly and ensure that a quality product is being delivered at the end. So now is the $1 million question. Who can adopt TQM? Like I mentioned before, some organizations are going to have an easier time than others. And by easier, I mean cheaper. So you can cheaply and easily adopt this approach if, first of all, you have the total buy-in of management. I can't emphasize this enough. If you don't have the total buy-in of management for this, you will have to get it, or it is doomed to fail. Management has to be convinced of this approach because it involves the entire organization. It's not something that a development team or an individual developer can implement on their own. The second really important component is that you have to recognize that quality management will always require resources, it will always require money, and it will always require employee time. Not having dedicated quality processes will not change that. So I would argue that it can reduce the amount of resources and employee time and improve the way that those are focused, but it's important to recognize that this will always be an investment, and there's nothing that I can say that will make that different. Some places already have some elements of TQM in place. So one thing that my organization already had when we started to move in this direction was that in a lot of parts of the organization anyway, we have total psychological safety, and that is extremely useful when you're implementing TQM. So it makes it a lot easier for people at different parts of the process to speak up when something isn't right and to critique their own and others' ideas when you feel like you're not on the verge of getting fired if you admit you made a mistake, things of that nature. Any of the things that I mentioned on the other slide can be potential elements that might be similar or different in each organization. So you want to kind of think about those and look at how many of them are already the case in your org. If your organization has a culture of effective and multi-directional cross-functional communication, that's also extremely helpful. And that's only more important now that we've moved to primarily remote. Good automated test coverage is a huge component of quality, even with TQM. So having good automated test coverage on your code bases already is a great place to start. And by good automated test coverage, I'm talking about the amount of test coverage, the quality of test coverage, and typically, as I've discussed in other talks and elsewhere, I prefer to have a combination of unit and integration or acceptance tests. Management needs to provide resources and create conditions where at each point in the process, employees are capable of doing their job well. That may seem like a bare minimum, but that is the job of management in a TQM organization, is to make sure that the conditions are right for employees to do their job well. And that doesn't just mean that making sure that people's software is up to date and that they have a working laptop. It also means conditions like psychological safety, conditions like preventing burnout, positions like supporting people in things that they may be going through personally so that they're, able to feel supported and concentrate on the work at hand and really do that in the best way possible. Another thing is pressure to produce quickly. Obviously, for certain situations, you need things done at a particular time. If your Cyber Monday site is not up by Cyber Monday, you're going to have a problem. But making sure that timelines are realistic is key. And making sure that people do have as much time as it's going to take them to do the job adequately, at least. So here are some other success factors as far as organizational culture that are worth considering if you're looking at a move in this direction. Openness and safety are the most important in my mind. So anyone, even the most junior person on your staff, should feel comfortable asking questions and should feel comfortable critiquing their own and others' work. Asking someone why they've done something that way is valid in any case. It's, it doesn't have to be a hostile question, and you don't have to be defensive when someone asks it. People need to feel safe admitting and discussing their own weaknesses and mistakes. So a culture where that's going to cause someone to be criticized or disciplined is going to not be conducive to a TQM approach. I also think that a collaborative environment over a competitive environment is important. When you're not working together, when you're focused on competing with one another, it means that you're gatekeeping, you're not collaborating with people to come up with the best idea, you're jockeying to make sure that your idea is chosen. And to me, that's a big difference and is highly detrimental to quality. Accountability, not pressure, is the key here. So keeping in touch with people, making sure that they have what they need. Solving problems proactively, but not simply putting pressure on people to do better, because most people are already their own worst critic. Appropriate management involvement is another key success factor. So the role of management in a TQM resource or organization, which I'm going to emphasize over and over, is providing people with the resources and conditions where they can succeed, and giving people the autonomy to do their jobs and produce quality results. So what can you do as a dev team? Like I said, if you don't have the total buy-in of leadership, and I'm talking about organizational leadership, not team leadership. If you don't have the total buy-in of organizational leadership, there's a limited amount that you can do as a developer or engineering manager. However, there are some important steps that can still improve your process. So one of those is communicating regularly with product and design. So you always want a bi-directional conversation to be happening with people in product and design, because they can continue to refine their ideas, critique implementations, as well as you can say, this design looks good, but when we click this button, the view is going to become too crowded on mobile. And giving this feedback to design can give them the signal that they should rework the design a little and bring it back. Everyone should be willing to accept feedback from anyone else, and giving and taking feedback are skills that can also be mentored, I would add. So if people are struggling with providing useful feedback or struggling to accept feedback appropriately, then those are things that their managers can coach with them. People should, again, feel safe constructively criticizing their own and others' work. It's a good sign when you can look back on a project and someone can say, you know, I wish I had done this differently, because that can always be a lesson for the future. I also would remind everyone that constructive feedback can also be positive. And while this isn't a core component of TQM, it is something that I strongly encourage people to recognize in their organizations, is that positive feedback is constructive and valuable. So when something is going well, make sure to recognize that as well. During a TQM process, communication should be ongoing, and at no point should anything be thrown over the fence to the next team, absolving the previous team of responsibility for anything that happens after that point. This is really important, that it continue to be a collaborative effort at each stage of the process, and that people working on each function remain accessible to one another to critique work, to bounce ideas off, to just make sure that everything is going as smoothly as possible, and that there are multiple people with visibility into the process who can provide feedback. And yeah, quality is the responsibility of everyone. Using agile rituals and practices is another thing that contributes to a TQM approach in a software environment. So kickoffs, deciding as a team on how each issue will be approached, while involving people from other functions or teams is appropriate. And who's involved in the kickoff might depend on the specific project. So it might be a project to optimize your database, for example, that'll involve different people than a process to implement a new UI. Pairing and mobbing can be really useful. Again, you know, I'm emphasizing collaborative approaches because I feel that people working together and coming together to find the right ideas and the best approaches is more effective than people vying to have the best idea. Structured pairing techniques are really useful. I know there are a few books out there on this topic. Details are kind of beyond the scope of this talk, but structured pairing techniques are really valuable. And when you're doing remote pairing, which more and more of us are these days, you want to make sure that you have appropriate tools for that. Retrospectives are another important thing, because when you look back on projects that you've been working on, you develop a perspective on future work. So you want to discuss what did and didn't go well, and you want to be able to discuss if there was anything that was overlooked. Why did that happen? Anything like that. And the focus needs to be on improvement rather than pointing fingers. Remember, you can learn from someone else's mistakes. So it's important to allow them to discuss those mistakes and give them some grace rather than pointing fingers or penalizing people for discussing things that didn't go well. Blameless postmortems. The term postmortem has fallen out of favor in recent years. I'm not totally sure why, but the blameless part is the key, that you want people to talk about how you as an organization can do better and move forward, and how you can continue to improve. Whose fault it was is water under the bridge. Robust code review is another thing that's fallen out of favor somewhat in recent years, but I still advocate for it. What I don't advocate for is the gatekeeping approach to code review that's done in a lot of organizations. So I want to spend a minute to discuss what that means. So The code review phase is the stage where you start looking for defects. You want to use at least one qualified reviewer who did not contribute code, and this is a hill I'll die on. I'm not saying that that person should look at this in a vacuum, especially if it's a larger piece of work. That person should absolutely have the people who did work on it walk them through it and explain the thought processes and things. But I'm a big believer that a fresh pair of eyes can pick things up that would not have been caught if it were limited to people who contributed code. During code review, you should not just read through a pull request and tick some boxes and type out LGTM and it's good. I think that testing needs to be done during code review, and especially in an organization where you don't have QA, this is critical. You need to do manual testing during code review. And reviewers should be thinking carefully about what edge cases will break things. If you enter a negative number in this field, will it break? If you enter 0 in this field, will it break? If you enter a number larger than a 32-bit integer, will it break? Those kind of things. Asking yourself how this has been tested and whether that's adequate is also really important. Keeping in mind that the happy path in software is often not the most common one. At my first QA job, when I was first getting into the industry, we only tested the happy path. And at one point I asked our head of product what percentage of the time customers actually went through the happy path. The answer was 5%. So be aware that other scenarios besides the happy path are often much more common, and make sure that those are optimized. Consider security. Make sure that HTTPS is enforced on a site. Things of that nature. Make sure that the site isn't vulnerable to injection attacks or cross-site scripting, those kind of things. And especially on non-trivial pieces of work, keep in mind that if you're reviewing code and not suggesting changes, it usually means there's something you've overlooked. Tracking all work is also really important. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but yeah, you want to create issues for small changes and make sure that those changes have adequate opportunity for review and testing. You want to have standards for pull requests or merge requests, like what information should be included in every description. I suggest, and I'll talk about this in the next slide, I think, as well, but context and links, linking a Trello card or a Jira ticket if that's not set up automatically. Description of the changes made, any considerations or reasoning as far as approach, testing, and documentation. And then you want to use those same manual testing procedures during the code review, used during code review to test the final product once it's released. When you do this, you don't want to just click through it in the browser you developed it in and call it good or whatever. You want to test the final products in as many environments as possible where they might be run. So if there's a different operating system, different hardware, different system architectures, older and newer machines or different browsers, different devices, whatever it happens to be, wherever your software might be used, make sure to test it there. I like using detailed pull request templates or else just having detailed standards for what needs to be put in pull requests. Both are good. Pull request templates can be a pain if you end up with a lot of pull requests that are things like, update some minor package that end up having to have this whole spiel attached to them. You don't want that. But you do want to have a detailed guideline for what information needs to be included, such as the context, what technical changes are being made, considerations, and thought processes, how it's been tested. I think it's also really important to ask what could still go wrong. Sometimes there are things that we're more and less sure about with the changes that we make. And if there are risks that can't be mitigated, that should be called out. Any screenshots or videos that illustrate the changes. The most important thing to remember about pull requests is that the PR is a start of the conversation, not the end of one. So these are all things that you can do to improve quality processes in your organization. And I hope that there was stuff in this talk that you can apply regardless of what your position is within an organization. Like I said, there's conditions that are necessary for TQM to be successfully adopted across an organization, starting most notably with the total buy-in of top management. So if you don't have that, though, there are still certain elements of this that you can put in place on your own team. And I hope I've given you enough of those to give you a place to start, give you something to advocate for with management. So to summarize, TQM, the total quality management approach, approaches quality from an organizational standpoint, not from a standpoint of just reducing defects just at the end of a process. TQM can reduce defects, can improve efficiency, and can make the end product more suitable for its intended purpose. Adopting TQM does require full management support, and it does require allocation of significant resources. Again, I think those resources are less and are better focused and better spent using a more TQM oriented approach, but that doesn't change the fact that this will cost money and this will cost time and this will cost resources. Yeah, dev teams can make simple changes to their process to incrementally improve quality and make it an integral part of their work, but for this to really be adopted organization-wide does require those things. So again, my name is Dana Scheider. My pronouns are she, he, and they. I've left my email address up here. My Twitter handle is here. I'm happy to continue the conversation offline. And at this point, I'll take any questions.